Picture this. I'm standing in a hut small enough to hear its heartbeat. The wind scratches at the walls like it's trying to get in, and the fire, my only companion, gasps for breath. The air smells of wood smoke and milk gone sour. A woman sits before me, wrapped in furs. She presses a glowing stone to her baby's chest so the child won't turn blue before sunrise. The glow flickers through her fingers, and I can't tell where the stone ends and her pulse begins. Now picture another world. Far south, the wind is warm enough to sing. There, a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert heat. Her anklets whisper as she moves, metal against stone, sound against silence. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet I've come to learn that both depend on the same secret. Tonight, I'll take you from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to trace how warmth itself became faith, power, and myth. Good evening, traveler. Before we begin, let's make a small ritual of it. Turn the lights down, low enough that the room forgets itself. Let the air settle, let the hum of your devices fade to something distant. Maybe you're listening from a small apartment where rain softens the window's edge, or from a city whose lights never quite go out. Maybe you're driving through the dark, voice in your ears, keeping you company. Wherever you are, stop for a breath. In through the nose, out through the heart. That's how they used to begin every story in Valmir, with breath. When I tell you to imagine, I don't mean to escape. I mean to return. Close your eyes for a second and picture a hearth so old the stones have names. The fire doesn't roar, it hums, steady, patient, a creature of habit. Smoke curls upward, thin as thread, carrying the scent of peat and pine resin. Outside, frost stretches its fingers across the valley, testing the doorframes for weakness. Inside, people speak in low tones, careful not to wake whatever sleeps in the silence between words. That's where our story begins, not in a palace, not in a place built for glory, but in the kind of room where warmth meant life and silence meant death. A room small enough to know the weather by the way the wood groans. If you wish, whisper where you're listening from. I find comfort in the idea that across centuries and miles, warmth still binds us. Someone once told me that stories are a form of fire, passed from one breath to another, keeping the cold at bay. Maybe that's why I keep telling this one. Maybe that's why you're here. I grew up around stories like this, old ones, carried on the breath of elders who spoke as though history were still unfolding just beyond the door. They'd start with small things. How the first frost looked that year, who forgot to bank the coals, how a neighbor's smoke rose too pale or too late. These weren't idle details, they were warnings disguised as gossip. In a world ruled by winter, warmth wasn't comfort, it was currency, protection, proof that you hadn't yet been abandoned by the living. Even now, centuries later, I can feel that logic hiding under the surface of modern life. The hiss of radiators in winter apartments, the coffee machine's steam sighing at dawn, the blue pulse of a screen keeping the dark from feeling infinite. It's all the same survival ritual, disguised as routine. We still build our days around fire, only now it's electrical, invisible, obedient. We think we've tamed it. We haven't. We've only learned to ignore its hunger. The people of Valmir never ignored it. They lived in dialogue with flame, every spark a question, every ember a small negotiation. That's what I want you to understand before we go further. They didn't see warmth as a tool. They saw it as a companion. Something alive, with moods and tempers. Something that could betray them if not treated with respect. So, dim your lights just a little more. Feel how the glow changes the walls around you. How shadows shift closer, not menacing but curious. That's how a story behaves when it begins to wake. The room I imagine now isn't large. The floor is packed earth, the ceiling low enough that a tall man must stoop. There's a table scarred by years of knives and cups, and near it, an iron pot simmering with whatever the season has spared. The air tastes faintly of smoke and onion. The woman by the fire hums, not a song, Exactly, more like a steady note to reassure the universe that she's still here. Outside, snow presses its ear to the door. Inside, the baby sleeps. You can almost hear the crackle of resin in the fire, the little sighs of sap turning to steam. The wind outside scratches at the wall, frustrated, as though trying to remind them that mercy has limits. But for now, inside this fragile circle of heat, life holds. That's the feeling I want you to keep. The fragile safety of a lit room surrounded by dark. The quiet gratitude of knowing that, for tonight, the world has allowed you to stay warm. Because everything that follows in this story, the discoveries, the rituals, the empires, will come from this moment. The moment when survival became ceremony. When a mother's instinct to guard a small flame turned into a people's faith. Take another breath. In through the nose, out through the heart. Do you feel how the air changes temperature as it leaves you? The villagers of Valmir believed that warmth moved through people like that, shared breath to breath, invisible but measurable. When they built their rituals, they weren't just worshipping fire. They were measuring the distance between hearts. I sometimes think our modern world has forgotten how to measure that distance. We track numbers, calories, degrees, but not the quality of warmth between us. We've replaced shared fire with personal comfort, community with climate control. Maybe that's why stories like this one still matter. They remind us that the earliest technology was empathy. That to survive meant to notice when someone else's flame was failing. Listen, the wind outside our story is still rising. But don't worry, I've banked enough coals for both of us. We'll make it through this night together, just as they did. You can relax your shoulders now. The hard part hasn't begun yet. For the next few moments, we'll stay here, in the quiet before history changes. You and I, and the faint hum of the fire that connects us to people long gone. If you're ready, we'll step back even further, to the time before faith had names, before kingdoms drew their borders. A time when people still believed that warmth was something borrowed from the earth, not owned by it. Hold that breath once more. In through the nose, out through the heart. Good. The room is dark enough. The story's awake. Let's begin. Before the names of kings were carved into marble, I learned to read a different script. Smoke rising from thatch. Frost filigreeing a window. The way a pot's lid trembles when the broth is about to boil over. That script is older than history and easier to believe. In Valmir, it wrote our days so clearly that even a child could follow the lines. I remember the village as a rhythm more than a map. If you stood on the ridge at dawn, the roofs looked like the backs of grazing animals, huddled against the wind. Below, paths braided through snow and mud, connecting door to door as neatly as stitches. Smoke unspooled from chimneys in pale ribbons, each one a small signature that said, "Still here, still warm, not yet surrendered." We counted seasons by the kinds of work the body could bear. Spring meant the sound of thaw cracking the river's skin. Men with poles tested ice like cautious accountants. Summer was laundry strung like prayer flags and the thud of axes farther up the slope, where the wood was drier and the air tasted of iron. Autumn. Cauldrons breathing, knives flashing, cellars swallowing what hands could spare. Winter was the opposite of conversation. You spoke only as much as heat allowed. No coins changed hands. Our wealth clinked in other ways. A pot that didn't burn stew, a roof that didn't leak, a calf carried through its first night by the steam of its mother's breath and a woman's steady humming. When we traded, we did it with time and tasks. I once gave 3 afternoons mending a neighbor's fence in exchange for a spool of spun wool. He said the wool would remember my hands and make the fence last longer. It was an odd compliment, but it made sense there. You could tell how a household was faring by the sound their door made in the evening. A door that opened slowly, with deliberation, meant there was soup left and the talk would be gentle. A door that slapped and shook told another story. Too many feet on too little wood, tempers boiled dry. I learned to carry silence like a bowl. When the bowl was steady, nothing spilled. When my wrists shook, words went to waste. The elders taught us to revere small consistencies. Birch bark curled just so before it caught flame. Hoof prints gathered where the path dipped. Water pooled there, then glassed over. If crows circled low, the frost would bite hard, and if the dog lay close to the oven without whining, the storm would pass over us. Wisdom sounded like folklore until you noticed it kept people alive. We gave our respect to whatever remained when everything else fled. The river in silence, the hearth in sleep, the stubborn, domestic holiness of tools, spoons blackened smooth by years of stirring, the slick handle of the bellows worn to a darker shine where a hand had insisted. The gods, if we had them, were merely names for gratitude. We spoke to Elandra, goddess of warmth, like we'd speak to a neighbor who owned a good ladder. With courtesy, with need, with the promise to return what we borrowed. Children were not spared from usefulness. They learned the weight of buckets before they learned their letters. I remember a boy, Mikel, who could carry fire between houses in a clay pan without losing a spark. We called him a king, and he looked at the snow as if it were a rival that might, with enough patience, grow fond of him. Little kings like him held the village together between storms. I took my education in kitchens and thresholds. In kitchens, I learned that scarcity is not only about food, it is about minutes. Bread needs time to rise, bones need time to surrender their marrow, tempers need time to cool. A pot left alone too long will scald at the bottom in a thin, bitter film that no hunger will forgive. In thresholds, I learned who would ask for help and who would rather starve than confess a draft. Pride, too, burns fuel. At night, the soundscape thinned. The world shrank to the breath inside four walls and the occasional complaint of wood settling its debts. I lay awake sometimes and counted the pauses between the fire's exhalations. If the pauses grew long, I rose and fed it. We didn't say, "I love you," often. We said, "Did you bank the coals?" It meant the same and more. It meant, "I intend for you to see morning." There were songs, yes, but they were practical in the way rope is practical. One was for kneading, one for carrying, one for the shiver that steals into fingers when the bucket's rim bites bone. Mothers sang to the fire as much as to their babies. "Sleep, little flame," they'd murmur, "hide from the wind." When the baby slept, the flame obeyed. When the flame dozed, a mother rose. Love was a relay race where no one could afford to drop the baton. If there was cruelty in our world, it wore the mask of fairness. Frost arrived on time, it did not play favorites. A lazy family suffered, but so did a diligent one when the weather decided discipline was irrelevant. We called this mercy because it kept us from hating each other more than we hated the cold. Blame, like smoke, has to exit somewhere. We tried to let it out the roof. I kept a notebook of sorts, charcoal on bark, mostly, to track small causes and effects. Damp wood caused sputtering flames. A handful of salt in the ash kept embers sleeping longer. A breath too eager fed a flame to death just as surely as a breath too stingy starved it. These were not revelations, only reminders. But reminders make a civilization when piled high enough. If strangers came, they came thin, and we welcomed them thinly. A spoonful of broth, a place by the wall, an hour of warmth bought by a morning's chopped wood. Hospitality was not generosity. It was a hedge against the day we might be the ones knocking. Our kindness had conditions, written in nobody's hand and everybody's bones. Contribute, or carry your cold with you. Sometimes I wonder whether we were happier than we knew. Not blessed. Happiness is not a blessing there but a byproduct, the way light slips under a door at noon. We felt useful. The village made a demand every hour, and meeting it gave the day shape. Idleness was not rest, it was exposure. Even our prayers worked, not because a goddess listened, but because a person did. Understand this before the rules change. None of us thought we were primitive. We were experts in the technology of proximity, heat carried by touch, knowledge carried by witness. We didn't conquer the elements, we negotiated with them and called the terms culture. The margin for error was so thin that anything wasteful felt immoral. The word for luxury in our tongue meant smoke without pot. On the last ordinary evening I remember, I stood outside and watched the sky bruise toward violet. From a dozen chimneys, smoke rose in careful braids, and I felt something like pride. We had, all of us, balanced on the knife edge again. The doors would open, steam would escape, bowls would make their rounds. Somewhere a child would count the stars aloud and lose his place after 7. Somewhere a woman would lift the lid and decide the stew had earned a pinch of her hoarded salt. The village would go on, which is all a village ever promises. I believed the world, like the river, had learned its channel and would keep to it. I believed the frost's mercy and cruelty would arrive on schedule, and we would answer in kind. I believed that if we tended our embers and minded our manners, the night would respect our effort. I was wrong, but not yet. Not while the doors opened slowly and the bowls moved hand to hand. Not while the fire hummed like an animal that has chosen, for now, to live with us. Not while the children ran errands of heat and returned with their eyebrows dusted in ash like early-grade prophets. Not while breath made small clouds indoors that dissolved into laughter. If you had asked me then what our secret was, I would have pointed at the simplest thing. The ember buried at dusk, the lid set just so, the quiet way a neighbor listened for your fire when yours fell silent. I would have said, without poetry, that the secret was noticing. That we survived by paying attention together. That answer would still be true when it stopped being enough. That winter came too soon, though at first we mistook it for eagerness. The early frosts had always been playful, testing us, snapping at our heels before retreating again. But this time the cold didn't flirt, it arrived as judgment. The river froze before the harvest was finished, pinning nets beneath sheets of glass. Grain sacks that should have lasted till spring went soft with rot. Smoke from hundreds of chimneys painted the sky black for a week and then vanished, as if the heavens had grown tired of pretending to care. I remember the silence that followed. Sound travels differently in cold air, even breath feels heavy. You could hear the creak of the frost in the trees and the faint cracking of water retreating into itself. I walked through the village one morning, listening for life, and heard only the snow shifting under my boots. The smell of smoke was gone. That was the first true warning. Valmir without smoke was a body without pulse. We were not strangers to hunger. But hunger that arrives on schedule can be negotiated with. Hunger that leaps ahead of its time is panic in disguise. Families pressed themselves together at night, skin to skin, whispering prayers to Elandra, goddess of warmth, as if her name could replace calories. The prayers grew shorter each night, like the daylight, until even words began to feel like a waste of heat. When the fires started to fail, it didn't make sense at first. A hearth that had burned steady for generations would wake up cold, its ash neat and untouched. The logs were intact, dry. People accused one another of carelessness. Some said children had played with the bellows. Others said the wood had been cursed by traders who wanted our crops. One woman claimed she saw the frost move inside the room like a shadow that breathed backwards. None of us believed her. Not yet. By the third week, it became clear that the fires weren't dying, they were being unmade. Flames simply refused to catch, as if the air itself had forgotten how to feed it. The priest, older than the village's memory, declared that the goddess was angry. He called a fast, though fasting felt redundant when the cupboards were already confessing their emptiness. We gathered in the meeting hall, a crowd of tired faces lit only by candle ends. He spoke of repentance, of forgotten rituals. His voice trembled with either faith or fear, it was hard to tell which. That night, 5 more homes went dark. I remember one of them belonged to Riska, a widow who lived on the northern edge. Her husband had died in the mines years before. She spoke more to her cat than to her neighbors. She was found in the morning, sitting beside a hearth filled with perfect ash, hands black, eyes wide. The cat survived, curled around her feet. People said she'd tried to feed the fire with her own breath. It was then that despair settled like snow. Slow, suffocating, oddly beautiful. We stopped talking about spring. We measured time by whose chimney still smoked. The priest began reading omens in the frost patterns on the window glass, but the patterns all said the same thing: too late. And then the stranger came. I didn't see him arrive, no one did. He was simply there one evening when I stepped outside to empty the ashes. Cloaked, silent, standing at the edge of the square where the wind made ghosts of our breath. His eyes glowed faintly, not like embers but like something remembering light. He carried nothing but a pouch at his side and the stillness of someone who has stopped fearing the cold. When he moved, the air seemed to move with him, denser, quieter. He knelt by the largest hearth in the square, where the communal fire had died that morning. Without asking, without ceremony, he reached into his pouch and drew out a handful of dust that shimmered blue, almost liquid in the half-light. He scattered it across the dead coals. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single spark leapt up, impossibly bright, followed by another, and another. The fire roared back to life as if it had been waiting to exhale. People stumbled backward, shielding their faces from the sudden heat. The snow around the hearth melted in a perfect circle. The stranger stood, his expression unreadable. His eyes reflected the flame, or maybe the flame reflected him, I can't be sure. When he finally spoke, his voice carried like breath through glass. Keep what you kindle. Then he turned and walked toward the northern road. The wind swallowed him. By morning, his footprints had melted into the frost. We didn't speak much that night. We just watched the fire burn. It burned differently, steady, deeper in color, as if it contained a secret vocabulary of heat. When dawn came, it was still burning. By dusk, it was burning stronger. Someone whispered that Elandra herself had sent him. Others said no goddess would come in human form. But none of that mattered. The important thing was that the fire had come back. The next day, we carried coals from that hearth to every house. Children ran with baskets lined in ash, their faces red with cold and wonder. When they pressed the new coals into old hearths, the fires leapt up, eager and bright. Smoke returned to the sky like a lost language rediscovered. We could breathe again, even if we didn't understand why. The priest called it a miracle. I called it mercy. But part of me, quietly, privately, called it debt. Miracles, I had learned, always come with terms we don't yet know. Within a week, Valmir was alive again. The frost still ruled outside, but inside every home the air shimmered with warmth. People laughed too loudly, as if to drown out their own fear. I found myself standing by my hearth one evening, staring at the blue edge of the flame, trying to decide whether it was beautiful or wrong. It felt like both. The priest built a shrine in the square where the stranger had stood. He named it the altar of Elandra's hand and declared that each household must offer a pinch of ash there every full moon. To thank the goddess for returning her breath, he said. No one argued. Gratitude was easier than curiosity. Still, questions lingered. Why had the stranger come to us, and not the next valley over? What was the dust he carried, and why did it shimmer like frozen lightning? Why did the fire now burn hotter but never consume the wood as quickly? The air in the huts felt charged, almost alive. Sparks leapt further from the hearths than before, but none caused harm. It was as if the flames had learned restraint. One night, as I was banking the coals, I thought I heard whispering, soft, rhythmic, coming from the fire itself. I leaned close and realized it was only the sap in the wood releasing steam, but the rhythm matched the breath pattern the priest had once taught. In through the nose, out through the heart. The realization chilled me more than the frost ever had. From that night forward, Valmir's fires never fully went out. Even when the last logs burned to gray dust, a faint glow remained beneath the ash, waiting to be stirred. The villagers began to believe that the goddess herself now slept inside the coals. We treated our hearths like altars, our ash like relics. And when a flame failed, as it rarely did, we did not mourn, we accused. That was how survival began to change shape. Gratitude hardened into duty, duty into rule. The miracle that had saved us started to draw invisible boundaries around our days. The stranger had given us warmth, Yes, but also something else. The beginning of a system. Looking back, I can see the hinge where faith turned into practice, and practice into control. But at the time, we were only grateful. We had been given back our fire, and in our relief, we forgot to wonder what the cost would be. Every age believes its miracles are blessings. Only later do we learn they were bargains. I've often thought that miracles are the seeds of bureaucracy. Give a people one inexplicable mercy, and they will spend generations building rules around it. Rules to preserve it. Rules to protect it. Rules to control who gets to touch it. That was what happened to us after the stranger's fire. At first, it was simple gratitude. We treated the flame with reverence, fed it as if it could taste loyalty. But warmth breeds order. Soon, we began to track who had the strongest fires, whose hearths burned longest. People noticed that the coals from Riska's home, the widow who once lost her fire first, seemed to carry heat longer than anyone else's. They said Elandra had chosen her lineage to be stewards of the flame. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. Belief created its own reality. The Riska family became the first of what we called the ash keepers. They began a practice of collecting embers from every household each month, mixing them in a great clay pit in the center of the village, and redistributing the ash. It was meant to balance the heat, to ensure that no family's flame grew too proud or too weak. The ritual had logic. Ash was insulation. When mixed and returned, it strengthened the next burning. But logic was only half the reason people obeyed. The other half was fear. If you refused to contribute your ash, you were denying the goddess her share of the warmth. From that first ritual, a hierarchy bloomed. A small one at first, almost harmless. The keepers recorded whose embers glowed brightest, whose cooled too quickly. They kept ledgers of warmth the way kings would later keep ledgers of taxes. Each entry was a story. Bara's coals held for 3 nights, her husband's cough returned. Talon's flame flickers, his wood must be unblessed. Numbers turned into judgment, judgment turned into faith. I remember standing by the pit during one of those early gatherings, the villagers huddled close for heat. The ash shimmered faintly blue under the moonlight, the color of the stranger's dust. When the keepers stirred it, sparks rose in spirals like a flock of fireflies. It was beautiful, undeniably. And dangerous in that way beauty often is, because it made obedience feel holy. Over time, we added more steps to the ritual. Someone decided that breath mattered. We were told to exhale into the ash as we offered it, so that our warmth, the literal heat of our bodies, might join the village's fire. The priests recited, in through the nose, out through the heart. Children learned it before they learned to speak their names. I used to think the phrase was poetry. Later, I realized it was a form of training. Every night before sleep, families buried their coals under ash. The next morning, they'd uncover them and breathe the pattern, coaxing the fire back to life. The sound of synchronized exhalation spread through the valley like a slow wave. If you stood outside at dawn, you could hear the entire village breathing in unison, a heartbeat made of air and flame. The keepers began visiting homes to inspect hearths, to advise on technique. They carried small bronze rods etched with symbols for measuring heat. If a family's fire burned too low, they left behind a token carved from bone, marking that household as needing purification. Too high, and you were accused of hoarding the goddess's gift. Either way, your name went into the ledger. At first, I thought it was protection. The winter after the stranger came was merciful, and the system worked. No one froze, no one starved. We believed our discipline had earned the goddess's favor. But mercy repeated too long begins to feel like proof of ownership. People forgot the frost's indifference. They started to believe they commanded warmth, that our rituals controlled something divine. New roles emerged. Fire mothers who oversaw the rituals, ensuring each family's breath matched the sacred rhythm. Coal runners, children tasked with carrying glowing stones from one home to another when a hearth failed. They wore mitts lined with fur, their faces smeared with ash to protect against the goddess's jealousy. The children loved it at first, they called themselves messengers of flame. But some nights, the wind rose too suddenly, and the light they carried vanished into the snow. We buried those children under cairns of blackened rock, each grave marked with a faint ring of soot. Our faith had structure now. Temples were built from stone taken from the riverbed, each brick warmed by fire before being placed. We believed this preserved the building's soul against cold. Inside, murals showed the stranger's arrival, the blue dust, the kneeling figure, the words "keep what you kindle." But we had already twisted that phrase. We no longer thought of it as warning or wisdom, it was license. We were the keepers. The warmth belonged to us. The council of ashkeepers grew larger, more formal. They wore long cloaks stitched with silver thread that shimmered like frost. Their gatherings became processions. Drums made from hollowed logs, horns carved from elk bone, chants that imitated the rhythm of breathing. They called it the sharing of lungs. I attended one ceremony out of curiosity. The smoke from 100 torches rolled over the crowd in waves. People swayed in unison, each inhalation rising like tide, each exhalation falling. It was hypnotic, beautiful, and somehow wrong. I remember feeling my body join the rhythm against my will. Afterward, I asked one of the elders why it was necessary. He smiled, eyes shining with reflected flame. To remind us that warmth lives in community, he said. A lone fire dies. A shared one grows. It sounded noble, almost scientific. Only later did I understand its other meaning. That individuality was a kind of coldness, and coldness was sin. The keepers codified our lives. They decided how much wood each household could burn, how many stones could be warmed at once, even how far apart hearths should be placed to maintain the sacred balance. They began sending emissaries to neighboring villages, teaching the rituals as gospel. Some accepted, others resisted and were labeled frost-hearted. Trade shifted. We no longer bartered in grain or hides, but in embers, tiny discs of fired clay said to carry the goddess's breath. Historians, centuries later, would call this primitive thermodynamics, a quaint attempt to rationalize heat transfer through social ritual. They would find the ledgers, the tools, the clay discs. They would describe it as a precursor to science. But they would miss the core truth. It wasn't science or superstition. It was control born from fear, the only kind of control that lasts. And yet, for all its rigidity, the system worked. Fires stayed lit through storms that should have smothered them. Travelers spoke of seeing Valmir's valley glowing from miles away, as if the land itself had caught flame. The people grew proud. We began to call ourselves the warm-blooded. We pitied outsiders who still struggled against the cold. But beneath the pride was a quieter current, a memory of what came before. I remember my mother whispering once, "Fire used to belong to everyone." She said it not in rebellion, but in nostalgia, the way you might speak of a lost friend. She died the next winter, and I burned her tokens with her, as the keepers required. Her hearth was sealed and declared pure. After her death, I joined the Fire Mothers. It was not choice so much as inheritance. They taught me to count breaths, to measure coals by their glow, to recite the prayers that disguised themselves as instructions. I believed for a while. Belief is a kind of warmth too. It fills the spaces fear leaves behind. But belief cannot disguise the weight of watching. Every visit, every inspection, every ledger entry, it all whispered the same command. Keep what you kindle, but never too much. We had traded one terror for another. Still, no one complained. The system made sense, and sense is seductive. As long as the frost stayed outside, no one asked who decided which fires deserved to burn brightest. Looking back, I see that what we built wasn't faith or science. It was a mirror, a system reflecting our hunger to control what we most feared losing. The stranger had given us a spark. We had turned it into awe. And so Valmir endured. Its fires burned through centuries, untouched by storm or famine. But every flame, no matter how eternal it seems, eventually consumes its own fuel. Ours would be no different. Among the families entrusted to guard the flame, none carried heavier expectation than ours. My mother, Mira, was an ashkeeper by lineage but a healer by choice. A woman who measured warmth not in fires tended, but in lives returned from the edge. The villagers said her hands held the memory of every ember she'd ever touched. When a hearth faltered, people didn't call for priests, they called for her. I remember her hut most vividly in winter twilight. Smoke curled through the thatch like the last note of a song, carrying the smell of pine resin and crushed herbs. Jars lined the shelves, powders, petals, stones warmed smooth by her palms. The air inside was thick and alive, each breath felt borrowed from the fire. She used to say that heat was the most fragile medicine. Too much and it scalded, too little and it left the body open for the cold to finish what hunger began. Healing, she believed, was the art of balance, between burn and freeze, between will and surrender. The keepers called her superstitious. Yet when their own children fell sick, they came to her in the dark, faces covered, as if visiting sin. I was her only child. My father had gone south before I could speak his name, leaving behind a single token. A pendant shaped like a tear of glass. My mother wore it always, though the glass had cracked down the middle. She said it reminded her that even perfection has temperature, too cold, it breaks, too hot, it melts. I grew up listening to the rhythm of her work, the scrape of mortar and pestle, the low hum of a prayer disguised as breathing. I thought all mothers spoke in smoke and silence. She taught me to read the wind. It carries news, she'd whisper, her palm raised. You just need to know which language it's using. I tried to listen, but the wind spoke in riddles. It sounded like everything and nothing at once. One winter, an infant was brought to her door, blue-lipped, limp, wrapped in a shawl stiff with frost. The parents were frantic, voices brittle from cold and grief. Mira took the child without hesitation, placed her ear against its chest, and frowned. There's warmth here, she murmured. Just hiding. She reached for a small stone that she kept near the hearth, a river rock she'd found years before, smooth and pale. Holding it over the flame, she hummed softly until it glowed faintly red, then pressed it to the baby's chest. The smell of singed wool filled the hut, but she didn't flinch. She rocked the child gently, whispering, in through the nose, out through the heart. The same phrase everyone knew, but gentler, human. Minutes passed. Then the baby gasped, a fragile, miraculous sound, and color returned to its skin. The mother wept. The father dropped to his knees. Mira only nodded, exhausted. Don't thank me, she said quietly. Thank the stone for remembering how to be warm. That night, word spread through the village like fire in dry straw. They said Mira had stolen the goddess's power, that her touch alone could command the flame. Others said she was chosen, a vessel of Elandra's mercy. Either way, her hut became both sanctuary and suspicion. People came with offerings, grain, wool, candles. They also came with fear. What they couldn't understand, they tried to contain. The council of ashkeepers summoned her soon after. I wasn't allowed to enter, but I remember waiting outside the hall, the air heavy with incense. When she emerged hours later, her face was unreadable. They've given me a title, she said finally. Healer of the breath. It sounded like an honor, but her tone told me otherwise. Titles are chains when handed down by those who fear you. From that day forward, she worked under their watch. Every herb she gathered, every stone she warmed, had to be recorded in the ledgers. They sent apprentices to assist, though everyone knew they were spies. Mira endured it all with calm defiance. Let them watch, she told me. A flame doesn't stop burning because eyes are on it. I was 13 when the frost came early again. The air felt wrong, too dry, too bright, as if the sun itself had turned to glass. Fires began to fail despite the rituals. The keepers panicked. Some whispered that the goddess had withdrawn her favor. Others blamed Mira, claiming she had upset the balance by healing beyond permission. The same people who once brought her gifts now crossed themselves when she passed. On the longest night of the year, the wind rose like a creature unchained. The walls moaned, the door frame trembled, and the flames in every hearth shrank to blue needles. Mira sent me to fetch more wood, but when I returned, the air outside her hut shimmered with heat, the wrong kind, wild and roaring. The thatch was burning. I remember the screams, the red glow turning snow into steam. Neighbors formed a line, passing buckets, but the fire seemed to breathe faster than we could. Myra's voice cut through the chaos, calm, commanding. "Get the child out," she shouted. Someone pulled me away, though I fought them. I saw her silhouette through the flames, reaching for something on the table. A scroll, a bundle of herbs, I'll never know. Then the roof caved in. By dawn, only embers remained. The smell of my mother's work, the resin, the ash, the herbs, hung in the air like memory refusing to fade. The keepers called it divine reclamation. "Elandra has taken her servant home," they said. I wanted to scream, "No, you took her." But grief is cold, and I had no warmth left to spend on anger. They found me days later, wandering near the river, clutching the cracked glass pendant. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Only that traders from the south were passing through, and the council decided I should go with them. The goddess has new purpose for her, they told the crowd. The north must not cage her spirit. In truth, they feared me. Children of miracles grow into dangerous adults. The journey south was long and alien. Snow gave way to stone, stone to sand. The air changed color, from silver to gold, and the sky lost its mercy. I kept the pendant under my tongue when we crossed the desert, tasting its faint bitterness. At night, when the traders slept, I would press it to my palm and whisper my mother's prayer, in through the nose, out through the heart. The words steadied me when nothing else did. We reached Sedhem after months of travel. I had never seen so much light that wasn't fire. The city rose from the dunes like something the earth had decided to dream instead of bury. Domes glittered, fountains sang, and everywhere there was movement, water, fabric, voices. I was sold to the palace kitchens the same day we arrived. The trader who handed me over didn't even look back. The palace smelled of spices I couldn't name. Its walls shimmered with heat. I learned quickly to listen before speaking, to move quietly, to bow when the golden sandals passed. Servants like me were shadows in motion, existing between glances. Yet, in the library, behind walls of carved stone, I found a familiar hum. The fire there burned differently, steady, respectful, like the flames of home. It was in that light that I first heard whispers of the servant queens of Maris. Women who ruled by understanding rather than command, who balanced the heat of the sun with the cool of the earth. Their philosophy was not power, but equilibrium. Reading about them, I felt my mother near again, her voice folding around mine. Balance, always balance. I began to dream of those queens, of their silent cities, of a world where fire didn't demand obedience but offered conversation. I didn't know then that these dreams would change everything, that they would make me both queen and exile, savior and ghost. But that is later. For now, I was still the healer's daughter, a servant among marble halls, carrying a cracked glass pendant and a memory of snow that no heat could melt. Sedhem felt like a dream drawn in reverse, where light made shadows instead of chasing them away. The city rose from the dunes in rings of stone, each layer whiter than the one before, as if sand itself had been persuaded to turn into memory. The air shimmered with heat. Sound carried differently here, bent by the weight of the sun. When I first arrived, I thought even my voice would melt if I spoke too loudly. I was 16 when I entered the palace. My hands were raw from the journey and my northern accent drew smiles that weren't quite kind. But in Sedhem, usefulness could make beauty of anyone. Within weeks, I had learned the rhythm of the kitchens. The hiss of water on hot pans, the clatter of copper, the cadence of orders shouted in 3 languages. The palace was an organism that breathed through its servants. Each hallway was a vein, each courtyard a lung. Heat moved through it like blood. I kept my head low, but I listened. Servants are invisible until they aren't. That is our advantage. I learned which ministers quarreled over irrigation, which wives whispered about eclipses. I learned that the empire's wealth came not from conquest but from heat, how they used it, traded it, worshipped it. Water was their currency, fire their god. The priests of the solar temple said the sun was a mirror through which the divine gazed at humanity. The richer you were, the more mirrors you owned to catch its favor. At first, I found it absurd. But the longer I stayed, the more I saw that they weren't entirely wrong. Everything inside them revolved around balance, how much sun one could bear before turning to ash. People here had learned to domesticate the unbearable. They turned heat into comfort, ritual, and law. It reminded me of Valmir, though reversed. Where my people feared losing warmth, these people feared drowning in it. The palace itself was a study in temperature. Corridors alternated between scorching courtyards and cooled chambers shaded by latticework. Water trickled through hidden channels beneath the floors, whispering secrets to the stone. At midday, the queen's servants would hang wet cloth over the windows, and a faint breeze turned the air to silk. Everything was designed not to fight the sun but to negotiate with it. That negotiation fascinated me. I began to see patterns, the same equations my mother once taught through instinct rather than numbers. Warmth was not a resource, it was a conversation between opposites. I didn't know it yet, but this thought would be the first brick of my rebellion. The queen of Setham, Asethra, was nothing like the rulers in northern stories. She was deliberate rather than grand, her power quiet as dusk. I saw her first during the festival of the solstice, when the nobles gathered in the Hall of Mirrors to offer thanks to the sun. She walked barefoot, her dress simple, her skin shining with oil that caught every reflection. When she passed, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Later, by chance or fate, I came to her notice. I had been delivering linens to the library, a vast room of marble and shadow, its walls lined with scrolls that smelled of ink and dust. She was there, alone, studying a map carved into stone. I froze, uncertain whether to speak or flee. She turned before I could decide. "What do you see?" she asked. I thought it was a trick. I mumbled something about the lines being beautiful. She smiled faintly. "Not beautiful. Alive. These are veins. The veins of water that keep Setham breathing." Her voice reminded me of my mother's, measured, precise, unwilling to waste breath on lies. She asked my name. When I told her, she paused on the northern syllables, as if tasting snow for the first time. "Liana," she said softly. "From where the frost speaks." After that, I was summoned to the library often. At first to clean, then to fetch scrolls, and finally, to read them aloud when her eyes grew tired. She discovered quickly that I could read both the northern runes and the local script. I think it surprised her that a servant could be fluent in anything beyond obedience. But she didn't treat me like a curiosity. She treated me like a mirror that had been waiting to be noticed. We spent hours in the filtered light, tracing the histories of heat. The scrolls told of ancient cities that built their faith around balance, the servant queens of Maris among them. They were said to have ruled not by decree but by understanding, mediating between desert and oasis, light and shadow. Their emblem was a divided circle, half flame, half wave. Asethra believed their civilization had discovered a harmony lost to time. "Power without balance burns," she said once, "but balance without power freezes." The world needs both. Those words stayed with me. I had heard their echo in Valmir, in the way my mother measured warmth. But hearing them here, from a queen who walked barefoot on marble, gave them new weight. The more I learned, the more dangerous I became. Knowledge is heat. It expands until something breaks. Asethra began asking my opinion in matters beyond my station. How to cool the cisterns, how to store grain without rot. I suggested layering clay jars with saltwater-soaked cloth. It worked. She smiled like someone who had found a long-lost rhythm. Soon I was moved from the kitchens to the library permanently. The other servants watched me with suspicion, the scholars with annoyance. To them, I was an intrusion of labor into intellect. But Asethra defended me. "The girl from Frost sees patterns we have forgotten," she said. She began to speak of me publicly, calling me her advisor of balance. The priests were less pleased. They saw in me a rival creed, the whisper of an old heresy. The cult of Maris had been outlawed centuries ago for claiming that the sun and earth were equals, not master and servant. To the priests, such words were blasphemy. To me, they were memory. Despite the tension, the queen continued to trust me. She allowed me access to the observatory, a tower where the desert wind never stopped singing. There I studied the movement of heat across stone, the rhythm of air rising and falling. I began to write small notes in both tongues, trying to merge what the North had known about retention with what the South knew of dispersion. It was crude, but it worked. The palace grew cooler. The crops near the river flourished. The people called it a miracle of the queen's wisdom. The priests called it interference with divine order. I called it a conversation between elements. For a while, that conversation was peaceful. The queen's trust deepened into something tender, though unspoken. We would walk the colonnades at dusk, the marble still warm under our feet. She spoke of her youth, of the burdens that came with being the axis of 1,000 expectations. "They think ruling is command," she told me once. "It's actually listening. But they only obey what they can see, not what they feel." I understood. The more she trusted me, the more the court resented it. Whispers followed us like shadows. They said the northern girl whispered spells into the queen's ear, that she cooled the air not with science but sorcery. They claimed I was teaching Asethra to silence the gods. The first time I heard those rumors, I laughed. The second time, I realized laughter was a luxury I could no longer afford. Power shifts quietly at first. Eyes that once looked at you with curiosity begin to look for fault. Every kindness becomes evidence. Every word, proof. Yet even as suspicion grew, something else was happening. The queen's policies, drawn from our long conversations, were transforming Setham. She opened the wells to the poor, expanded the cooling towers to the outer districts. For the first time, the rich and the servants shared air of the same temperature. It was revolutionary, though no one dared to call it that. I remember standing on the palace balcony one evening, watching the city glow. The horizon shimmered like molten gold, and for a moment, I thought of Valmir, its frozen roofs, its people huddled around small, obedient flames. I wondered if they would understand what I had found here. That warmth and cold were not enemies, only extremes of the same truth. I believed, foolishly, that knowledge could heal both. But knowledge is like fire. It promises light but devours faster than you expect. The priests began to move against us. The courtiers whispered to the king that his wife had grown bewitched by a servant. And in the alleys, people began to pray not to the sun but to balance. When belief spreads too quickly, it becomes plague. And every plague needs a body to blame. Knowledge, once feared, had become fashion. The word balance was everywhere, painted on walls, woven into songs, stamped on coins. People no longer bowed to the sun alone. They began to whisper prayers to the air that cooled their skin. At first, the priests tolerated it. Every faith borrows from the one before it, and imitation can be mistaken for devotion. But the whispers kept spreading, and the warmth of belief began to drift from the temple toward the palace. The more people thanked the queen for their comfort, the less they needed the gods. That was when they turned their eyes on me. I had known for months that the priests were watching. They stopped hiding their spies in the library. They began sending scrolls, for my review, written in the coded language of insult. The courtiers followed suit. A servant who rose too high was an embarrassment that needed to be corrected. A woman who rose that high was an offense that needed to be erased. I told Asethra I could sense the shift. She only smiled, tired, indulgent. "Power has always been borrowed," she said. "If we're lucky, they will return it gently." She underestimated the appetite of men who believed divinity could be quantified by sunlight. The turning point came not through politics but through a story a rumor so efficient it might as well have been engineered. It began in the servants' quarters, carried by a man whose brother worked in the temple kitchens. He claimed that the incense burning in the queen's private chapel was made from human ash. Within a day, it became northern ash. Within 2, the ash of heretics. By the end of the week, it was my ash, burned from the bodies of those who had opposed me. Rumor is faster than fire because it doesn't need oxygen. It feeds on fear. I tried to ignore it. The queen, against my advice, invited the High Solar and his council to a private audience. "Let them look me in the eye," she said. "They will see truth. But truth, once people are certain of sin, looks like deceit." The audience took place in the Hall of Reflections, a chamber of polished marble meant to magnify light. That day it magnified accusation. The High Solar was draped in gold, his attendants carrying bowls of burning resin. "Majesty," he said, bowing just low enough to keep pride intact, "your servant has strayed beyond mortal understanding. She claims knowledge that belongs to the sun alone." Asethra's voice was steady. If the sun feared knowledge, it would not rise. The exchange that followed was less debate than performance. Every question was a trap, every answer a confession. They demanded to know how I had cooled the air without prayer, how I had made the wells run longer, how I had dared to translate forbidden texts. I answered as plainly as I could, by listening, by measuring, by patience. They heard only blasphemy. To admit that human reason could temper divine heat was to unseat the gods themselves. Then came the final accusation. The High Solar produced a fragment of parchment, one of my own notes written in 2 languages, the northern script beside the southern. He held it aloft like evidence of contagion. "This is her creed," he said. 2 tongues entwined in defiance. Fire and frost in one breath. She seeks to merge the sacred and the profane. The queen reached for the parchment, but he withdrew it. "Majesty," he said softly, "if you continue to protect her, the gods will withdraw their light." A hush fell. Light flickered through the room, fractured by mirrors. For the first time since I had known her, Asethra hesitated. She looked at me, and in her gaze I saw calculation battling faith, love battling survival. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "The gods do not threaten," she said, "they teach." It was too late. The priests had already won. The rumor had spread beyond walls, carried by the city's heat itself. Crowds gathered in the streets at night, chanting hymns older than the queen's reign. The nobles began to withdraw their allegiance, retreating to the temples. The king, Arian, gentle, malleable, loyal to whichever power filled the room, found himself surrounded by men whose robes glowed brighter than his crown. He summoned me privately, in the middle of the night. I found him pacing by the window, the moon painting his face silver. "They want you gone," he said. His voice was desperate, like a man trapped between his heart and his history. "If you leave quietly, perhaps they will forget." I laughed. "The moment I leave, they will write my story without me." He looked away. "Then let me write it first." By dawn, the decree was ready. Liana of Valmir, stripped of title and station, charged with corrupting divine law. My name was to be erased from the records. The queen refused to sign. For 3 days, the city held its breath. On the 4th, the sun did not rise, or so it seemed. A sandstorm blotted out the sky, turning daylight into amber dusk. The priests declared it a sign of divine anger. The people, terrified, begged for sacrifice. That night, they came for me. Soldiers in white armor, eyes hidden behind veils. They bound my wrists with cords of linen soaked in oil, symbol of purification. I was brought before the council at dawn. The hall was filled with spectators, nobles and servants alike, drawn by the spectacle of a fall. The High Solar recited the charges, consorting with forbidden knowledge, desecrating sacred heat, polluting the royal line. I stood silent. When he demanded confession, I raised my eyes to meet his. "Fire does not ask who it warms," I said. For a heartbeat, even the torches stilled. Then the hall erupted, some gasping, others shouting. The high solar struck his staff against the floor. "Blasphemy," he cried. "Her tongue is flame." They tore away my crown, though it had never truly been mine. My wrists burned from the oil-soaked cords, and the scent of my own skin turning to smoke filled the air. I remember thinking how strange it was that pain could smell holy. Asethra tried to rise, but the priests restrained her. She called my name once, softly, not as a queen but as a friend. I answered with a look I hoped she would understand. This was not her failure. The crowd wanted redemption, and someone had to play the cost. The next morning, my chambers were found empty. The guards claimed they'd fallen asleep at their posts, that a wind had swept through the palace, extinguishing every lamp. When they awoke, I was gone. Some said I escaped through the aqueducts. Others said the goddess herself had reclaimed me, as she had once taken my mother. The truth? I walked into the desert. I left behind the pendant, the scrolls, the fire. I walked until sand replaced thought, until the horizon blurred into light. I felt no anger, only a deep, almost tender sorrow. The desert was quiet, like a hearth gone cold. At night, I scattered the last of the blue dust I had kept since childhood, letting it drift on the wind. It shimmered briefly, then disappeared. For the first time, I felt free of warmth's tyranny. Behind me, Setham began to devour itself. The wells dried. The air towers failed. The priests declared new fasts, new purifications. The queen's health waned, her once steady steps faltering. Some said she died in her sleep. Others claimed she walked into her own chamber fire, whispering my words. Fire does not ask who it warms. When archaeologists centuries later found the ruins, they described layers of blackened marble fused by heat. No trace of bodies, only ash that glittered faintly blue under sunlight. If I am remembered at all, it is as her shadow, the servant who became a queen, the queen who became a ghost. But I was neither. I was only the daughter of a healer, carrying her mother's lesson too far. That warmth is sacred only when shared. And so it ended, as all empires do, not with conquest, but with the quiet return of the cold. Centuries pass the way sand passes through fingers, imperceptibly, until the hand is empty. When Setham finally sank beneath its own weight, no one noticed right away. Empires die in silence before they crumble in noise. The dunes folded over the marble, the wind swept away the names, and the sun went on pretending to shine for someone else. Only the heat remained, humming faintly beneath the surface like an old story rehearsing itself. Then came the age of machines. We built engines to summon warmth on command, furnaces that tamed fire into labor. What we once prayed to, we began to pay for. Valmir's ritual of breath became the sigh of ventilation systems. The goddess of warmth retired quietly, replaced by thermostats. We stopped fearing the cold because we had learned to simulate comfort. We forgot that warmth, like mercy, was never meant to be owned. It was 2023 when the archaeologists arrived. A small team from Alexandria University, funded by a museum that wanted spectacle. They came chasing rumors of a lost solar observatory somewhere near the edge of the western desert, not far from where old maps placed Setham's heart. I was part of the team, not as a scholar but as a translator. My mother was Egyptian, my father Northern, though I had never seen snow. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to the idea of a city built between fire and frost. We pitched camp near a ridge of pale stone that looked, under certain light, like the ribs of a sleeping creature. For weeks, the desert gave us nothing but mirages. Then, one evening, as the sun collapsed behind the dunes, I saw something glint. Not gold, blue. Faint and deliberate. The others thought it was a trick of reflection. But I walked toward it, sand biting my ankles, until my hand brushed something smooth beneath the surface. We dug with brushes, then with reverence. What emerged was not treasure, not even structure, just a shard of resin, clear as glass, sealed around a piece of parchment no larger than a hand. The writing shimmered under our lamps, half in angular northern strokes, half in the rounded script of the desert. Two languages holding each other's breath. At first glance, it looked like a prayer. But the more I read, the more it resembled instruction. An invocation not to gods, but to balance. In through the nose, out through the heart. Fire, remember frost. Frost, remember fire. The words pulsed with rhythm, like the fragments of an equation that had once kept the world alive. Beneath them, feigned as if written by another hand centuries later, was a signature, Liana of Valmir. The name caught in my throat. I had read it before, mentioned in fragments of legend, dismissed by scholars as myth. The servant queen, the woman who vanished into the desert. But this was no mythic prose. The handwriting was deliberate, almost scientific. She hadn't been worshipping, she'd been recording. When I brought the fragment to camp, the others grew excited. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Hassan, photographed it from every angle, then shrugged. A hybrid text, he said. Trade routes always produce odd combinations. But his voice lacked conviction. We both knew hybrid didn't mean accidental. It meant deliberate. It meant someone had tried to merge worlds. We found more fragments over the following days. Bits of pottery etched with spiral symbols. Traces of pigment that once formed a divided circle, half flame, half wave. Carbon dating placed them roughly 2,000 years before our era. Each fragment carried traces of blue dust embedded in its surface. When analyzed under ultraviolet light, the dust glowed faintly, just as the old stories described. At night, I couldn't sleep. The desert was too quiet, too knowing. I sat by the camp's generator, watching the pulse of the red indicator light. It blinked like a heartbeat. I thought of Liana's words, written centuries apart from my life. Fire does not ask who it warms. The next morning, we found the temple, or what was left of it. The roof had collapsed long ago, but the floor remained intact, polished smooth by wind and time. At its center lay a shallow basin carved from a single slab of black stone. When the sun hit it directly, it glowed as if filled with water. But it was not reflection, it was heat trapped in memory. We poured a handful of sand into the basin. The grains shimmered, then cooled. Hassan cursed softly. Residual temperature, he said. Thermal retention from the quartz. But there was no quartz. I touched the stone. It felt alive, like skin after fever. That night, we debated what it meant. The scientists wanted data, numbers, precedent. I wanted meaning. What if this isn't magic or technology, I said, but continuity? What if they understood heat is something you could share without losing it? They smiled politely. In academia, poetry is the language of amateurs. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every civilization, every machine, every hand that reaches for warmth, it all comes from the same hunger. We build walls to trap the fire, call it progress, call it safety. But all we've really done is make the hearth invisible. Later that week, I woke to find the desert unusually cold. The generator had failed, the heater silent. My breath fogged in the air. I wrapped myself in a blanket and stepped outside. The moon hung low, blue around the edges. In the distance, I saw a flicker of light, just one, small, steady. I walked toward it, the sand crunching under my boots. It came from the basin. The same one that had seemed dead for centuries. A faint glow pulsed within it, blue, not gold. The same shade as the dust in the fragments. I crouched, reached out, and felt warmth brush my palm. Not heat exactly, but recognition. It was as if the stone remembered the touch of every hand that had ever sought comfort from it. When I told Hassan, he dismissed it. Thermal anomaly, he said. But I noticed that when he approached the basin, the glow dimmed. When I came near, it brightened again. He saw it too. He looked at me strangely after that, as if the line between scholar and myth had shifted a little. We sealed the site 2 days later. The museum wanted to move the artifacts, but bureaucracy stalled. Paperwork delays miracles better than gods ever could. Before leaving, I slipped a tiny fragment of the parchment into my pocket. A piece so small it could have been mistaken for dust. On the flight home, I held it up to the window. Sunlight passed through it, illuminating the faint marks of ink. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in wind. Back in the city, I placed it on my desk beside a cup of coffee, steam rising in the morning light. The room was warm, too warm. I turned off the heater, but the air held its heat. The fragment glowed faintly blue, as though it were breathing. Maybe it was a trick of refraction. Or maybe, across 2 millennia, a whisper had found me. Sometimes, at night, I recite the old breath pattern. In through the nose, out through the heart. The air seems to answer. I imagine Myra's hut, the queen's marble halls, the desert between them, all stitched together by the same invisible current. We like to think we've outgrown the old fears, but when the power flickers, when the room darkens, I still feel it, that instinctive reach for warmth, for proof of life. I think of Liana's last words. They were never prophecy, they were instruction. Every civilization survives on borrowed heat. Every person, too. We pass it along, thinking we own it, until one day the flame asks nothing in return but to be remembered. And if you're reading this, if the air around you feels a little softer than it did a moment ago, maybe that's her, still sharing the warmth she couldn't keep. So tonight, as your room grows quiet and the hum of the world fades to a low, familiar sigh, imagine the last ember of a fire that refuses to die. It glows faintly in the dark, small, steady, patient. Maybe it's just a trick of the eyes, or maybe it's something older remembering you. I think of Liana often. Not as a queen or a servant, not even as a legend, but as a bridge. A woman who carried warmth across centuries of misunderstanding, who turned faith into science and back again. She never asked to be worshipped. She only asked that we keep what we kindle, and share it when the night grows too long. From the frozen huts of Valmir to the golden sands of Setham, the same story plays itself again and again. Empires rise on the promise of warmth and fall when they mistake ownership for care. The villagers buried embers to survive the frost, the desert queens trapped sunlight to survive the heat. Both believed they were mastering the elements. Both forgot that every act of control is also an act of separation. When the archaeologists found her words, in through the nose, out through the heart, they called it metaphor. But I think it was a blueprint for living. Breath, like warmth, must move to stay alive. The moment you hoard it, it cools into ash. Perhaps that's the real inheritance of these old fires. Not the rituals, not the ruins, but the reminder that comfort is communal. Every flickering light you see, on a candle, a stove, a screen, is the descendant of a prayer whispered by people who feared the dark but refused to surrender to it. So before you close this story, pause. Feel the air leaving your lungs, carrying a little of your heat with it. Somewhere, someone will breathe it in. That's how warmth travels, unseen, unmeasured, unstoppable. Maybe that's what the stranger meant when he said, "Keep what you kindle." Not protect it, not possess it, but remember it long enough to pass it on. And if you listen closely, under the murmur of your machines, you might still hear the rhythm that shaped 1,000 winters, in through the nose, out through the heart. The story ends where it began, with a quiet room, a small fire, and someone watching its light tremble against the dark. The difference is that now, you know what that light carries. It's older than fear, older than faith, older than you. Fire does not ask who it warms. It only asks to be remembered.